This episode is brought to you by ChatGPT. Hey, it's Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast. Have you guys heard about ChatGPT work? It's the new way to use ChatGPT for bigger multi-step projects. And when you need more than just answers, give ChatGPT work access to your apps and files, and it can create real work documents like spreadsheets, slides, and structured reports. Get started at chatgpt.com by selecting work mode, available on Plus and Pro plans.
I see you.
Avatar: Fire and Ash is now streaming on Disney+. It's the film critics are calling the best Avatar yet.
Go, 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 go!
A true epic and completely jaw-dropping.
This is the only pure thing in this world.
Return to Pandora on Disney+.
It will be an adventure for the whole fam.
And watch the Oscar-winning phenomenon at home.
This is sick!
Avatar: Fire and Ash, now streaming on Disney+. Rated PG-13.
At some point in your life, you have known something was wrong and decided not to know it. You constructed a more comfortable explanation, maybe found people who agreed with it, and called that agreement evidence. I have done this. You have done this. The only difference between us and the people we shake our heads at is the institution we chose and how long we stayed.
You're listening to Unbound, off script. No outlines, no safety nets, just Beth Curry talking about whatever the hell she wants, or whatever the hell you've asked her to uncover. It's unfiltered, it's unpredictable, and it's officially started. Pull up a chair and don't expect her to stop talking anytime soon. She's a total blabbermouth. Take it away, Beth.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Unbound. This is an off script episode. I'm Beth. So I want to start today with something I'm not just saying in a very casual way, because I think it's easy to kind of make this type of statement as, I don't know, a rhetorical device and have it kind of land as some sort of a performance or something. I am not above what I'm about to talk about, okay? I want to say that at the top and mean it, not so much as a disclaimer that, I don't know, protects me from being called a hypocrite, but because it's structurally important to the whole entire conversation, okay? The mechanisms we're going to examine today don't skip people who are aware of them. Awareness is not immunity. I know that from personal experience, and I'll come back to that. So what I can say, and this is also personal and also true, is that where I live now, both physically and psychologically, I am more awake to the games than I used to be. Okay. I see the architecture more clearly. I catch the moves a lot faster. I'm still fooled sometimes, of course. You know, there are almost certainly places where I'm being fooled right this second and don't know it yet. But I'm not playing the game I was playing before. And I think that matters. Not so much because it makes me better than anyone still inside it, but because I think it means I remember what it felt like to be inside it. And I think that the memory is more useful than any theoretical understanding I could offer. Okay. So today I'm going deep on two kind of related ideas that I wanted to combine into one episode for a bit, because separately they're interesting, but together they're like this complete picture of something genuinely important. So the first is why we stay loyal to institutions like corporations, maybe religious organizations, governments, even social movements that are actively working against our interests. And the second is how those institutions use the mechanics of our own cognition to kind of keep us there, right? And then kind of woven through both, Occam's razor. It's parsimony. The principle that the simplest explanation that fits the facts is usually the correct one. And the question of why, when that simplest explanation is threatening, we become suddenly and urgently interested in more complicated explanations. Okay. So I'm going to start out. Jennifer Fried is a psychologist at the University of Oregon who, in the 1990s, developed this framework called betrayal trauma theory. She was initially working with survivors of childhood sexual abuse, specifically trying to understand why so many survivors had no conscious memory of the abuse, or they minimized it, or in some cases maybe maintained close relationships with the people who had harmed them. And the answer that she developed is one of the most important and underused concepts in psychology, and it applies kind of far beyond its original clinical context, okay? So her argument is this: when the person who hurts you is also the person you depend on for survival, for food, shelter, safety, belonging, all of that stuff, your brain faces this impossible calculation. Acknowledging the betrayal is dangerous because the betrayer is also your protector. So staying aware of what's being done to you threatens the relationship that you need in order to survive. So the brain, in its pragmatic and sometimes ruthless way, resolves the conflict by choosing not to know. Okay? Betrayal blindness is the motivated unawareness of betrayal when the awareness would threaten a relationship or a system that the person depends on, right? It's not stupidity at all. It's not weakness. It's just the brain making what it calculates to be the least dangerous choice available to it, okay? So Jennifer and her colleagues extended this framework beyond child abuse fairly quickly because it kind of became clear that the mechanism was not limited to parent-child relationships. It applies anywhere that dependence and betrayal kind of coexist, right? Which turns out to be most of the major institutions of modern life, of course. You depend on your employer for your income and your health insurance and your professional identity, your daily social structure, and probably in some cases your sense of worth. And when your employer does something that should register as betrayal, maybe they underpay you or they lie about an opportunity, maybe they extract your labor in conditions of manufactured urgency for the benefit of people who've already done more than they need. I don't know, like whatever they're doing, right? I could create any type of scenario. The brain does not automatically generate appropriate outrage. It generates a search for an alternate explanation. Maybe the company's just going through a difficult period, or maybe you don't have the full picture, and maybe this is just how business works, and maybe you'd be worse off somewhere else, whatever. So these are kind of the sounds of betrayal blindness in action, right? The alternative explanations are more comfortable than the accurate one. The accurate one would require some sort of action, and action would mean risk, of course, and risk would mean potential loss of the thing you depend on. So the brain offers you a gift. It's just a way of not fully knowing what you know. So I want to be specific about how this plays out institutionally because I think the abstract version kind of lets us off the hook in a way that the concrete version does not. Okay, so corporate loyalty is one of the most thoroughly studied examples of institutional betrayal blindness. And the research is not really flattering to anyone involved, including the people studying it, because understanding it doesn't really protect you from it, right? Organizational psychologist Blake Ashforth at Arizona State University has written extensively about what he calls organizational identification. This is like the degree to which employees incorporate their organization into their sense of self, right? When identification is high, the employee's self-concept and the organization's reputation are kind of fused, right? Like what's good for the company is felt as good for the self, and what's bad for the company is felt as bad for the self. This isn't really an accidental occurrence, right? Organizations actively cultivate this fusion because it produces motivated and loyal behavior that is extraordinarily cost efficient. So an employee who's highly identified with their organization doesn't need to be micromanaged, right? They self-direct toward organizational goals because these goals feel like their own. And they'll work late, not because they're being coerced to, but because leaving early would feel like betraying themselves. They'll defend the company in social situations where defense is neither required nor, if they thought about it carefully, warranted. And where it becomes a betrayal vector is when the organization does something harmful to its employees, customers, the public, the environment, whatever. The highly identified employee faces the same impossible calculation that Jennifer's betrayal trauma survivors face, right? Acknowledging the harm means acknowledging that the thing you've built your identity around is not what you believed it was. And the self-concept is threatened as directly as the attack, as if the attack were personal, right? So the mind goes looking for the alternative explanation, a misunderstanding, or maybe a competitor's smear campaign, maybe a regulation that doesn't apply to this particular case. Don't know. Out of context reporting. Who knows, right? Now, the tobacco industry understood this instinctively. internal documents revealed in litigation throughout the 1990s and summarized in Eric Conway's Merchants of Doubt show that the major tobacco companies knew with certainty for decades that their products caused cancer. They knew. Their own scientists told them, and rather than disclose this information, they spent like billions of dollars manufacturing scientific uncertainty. They were funding research designed to produce conflicting results and supplying the media with like this steady stream of experts willing to say that the evidence wasn't conclusive yet. They weren't primarily trying to fool the public. They were trying to give the public permission to choose not to know, right? To provide just enough alternative explanation that the betrayal blindness mechanism could do the rest, right? You didn't need to believe the tobacco company's scientists over the independent researchers. You just needed to feel uncertain enough that not knowing felt like a reasonable position rather than a motivated one, right? Now that playbook has been replicated across industries with a precision that would be impressive if it weren't completely appalling, okay? The sugar industry, the opioid manufacturers, the fossil fuel companies, the Climate Accountability Institute's research into internal documents from Exxon shows that the company's own scientists predicted global warming with remarkable accuracy from the 70s onward, while the company publicly funded doubt. And you know what? Where I am now, the doubt is pretty high on. I'm not going to get into it. That's a whole other episode. The playbook's always the same though, right? Like manufacture uncertainty, provide alternative explanations, make ignorance feel completely reasonable. Okay. So William of Ockham was a 14th century English friar and philosopher who articulated a principle of parsimony that has since become one of the foundational heuristics of scientific reasoning. Entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity. Okay, so competing explanations being equal, the simple one or the simpler one is preferable. Occam's razor. The simplest explanation that fits the facts is usually right. It's remarkable how selectively this principle gets applied. Okay, so when the simple explanation is benign, people apply Occam's razor pretty enthusiastically. The car didn't start because the battery is dead. Not because of a complex conspiracy involving the manufacturer, the fuel industry, and a family of raccoons who've taken up residence in the engine block. Fine. Simple explanation. Accepted. Dead battery. Whoop-de-doo. Moving on. When the simple explanation is threatening, though, like when it implicates someone you trust or something you've invested in or a version of the world you need to be true, suddenly the simple explanation is naive, right? It's premature. Maybe it's missing context. It's the mark of someone who doesn't really understand how complicated things really are. I don't know. I've watched this happen in real time and I've done it myself. Someone presents a pattern of behavior, a series of decisions by an institution that consistently benefits some people at the expense of others. And the simplest explanation is that the institution is prioritizing the interests of some people over others intentionally. And instead of accepting that, we generate this, my favorite word, complexity. We cite competing pressures and regulatory constraints and the difficulty of the market and sincere intentions of the individuals involved. Maybe even the isolated nature of each individual decision. Now, this complexity isn't wrong, exactly. Institutions are complicated, and individuals within them have genuinely good intentions. Most of the time. That's, again, a whole other episode. Regulatory environments are genuinely constraining, right? All of that is absolutely true, but complexity is also, like when we reach for it selectively and urgently in response to threatening simple explanations, a cognitive escape hatch, basically. It gives us permission to not apply Occam's razor to the situation we most need to apply it to, okay? There's a philosopher, Charles Sanders Peirce. He called the simplest explanatory inference abduction. So forming the most likely hypothesis to explain observed facts. The most likely hypothesis is usually the most parsimonious one. And when we find ourselves constructing increasingly elaborate alternative hypotheses to avoid the parsimonious one, like when the explanation we prefer kind of needs more moving parts and more assumptions and more special pleading than the explanation that we're avoiding. That asymmetry is information, okay? It's kind of the sound of something being protected from scrutiny. So what I've come to use imperfectly and with full awareness of my own susceptibility, when I notice that I'm reaching for something that's a little more complex, specifically in response to a simple explanation that's uncomfortable, I try to stop and ask what it would mean if the simple explanation were right. Not whether it's definitely right, because it might not be. I don't know. But what would it mean? What would have to change? What would I have to give up or rethink? If the answer to that question is a lot, I think that's worth thinking about, not so much as like this proof that the simple explanation is correct, but more as kind of a data point about why I'm motivated to complicate the shit out of it, right? So I'm going to go somewhere more personal for a moment and more specific, because I think the corporate examples are useful, but they're also kind of abstract. I've probably lost a bunch of listeners at this point. The betrayal blindness mechanism becomes most visible and most painful in religious institutional contexts, okay? Because the stakes are higher. So like what's being protected isn't like a financial investment or a job or anything. It's a cosmology, a community, a whole ass framework for understanding existence. Now, going back to Jennifer's betrayal trauma theory, it extends to what she and her colleagues call institutional betrayal. It's harm caused not by a single perpetrator, but by the institution itself through its responses to disclosed harm. So the research on institutional betrayal in religious contexts is extensive and genuinely difficult to read. So think about the Catholic Church sex abuse crisis. This was documented in excruciating detail in the Boston Globe Spotlight team in 2002. And by the Pennsylvania Grand Jury report in 2018, which found abuse by over 300 priests involving over 1,000 identifiable victims across just one state. This is perhaps the most extensively documented example of institutional betrayal in modern history. Okay? What makes it relevant to this conversation isn't just the scale of the harm, it's the architecture of the protection. So what the church did across decades, across countries, systematically, it did not simply fail to stop bad actors. It actively managed information in ways designed to preserve the institution's reputation at the direct expense of the victims. So abusive priests were transferred to new assignments, not removed, and victims and their families were pressured towards confidential settlements that prevented disclosure. And psychological reports flagging ongoing risk were filed and ignored. And bishops who knew wrote memos to each other documenting what they knew and then publicly denied knowledge. This is not an accident. It's like an institutional self-preservation mechanism functioning as designed, right? It's applied to a situation that exposed the profound cost of that mechanism. And the vast majority of the lay people in those communities, the people in the pews and the parents and the volunteers, whatever, they all stayed. They defended. They explained it away. They constructed alternative theories, because the church wasn't just their religious institution. It was their community, and it was their identity and their understanding of the nature of reality, maybe their link to deceased parents and grandparents. It was their children's school. It was their support network. It was their moral framework, Acknowledging the institutional betrayal fully would have meant dismantling all of that simultaneously. And that is not a choice that most human nervous systems make voluntarily. Okay. I want to be clear. This is not unique to the Catholic Church, and framing it as a Catholic problem misses the generalization. The same mechanism appears in every closed community with high investment, high identification, and information asymmetry, of evangelical megachurches, multi-level marketing companies. There's another one. Certain political organizations, certain therapeutic communities, maybe certain families even. The specifics change. The architecture is pretty much identical. You depend on the community. The community requires your loyalty. Loyalty means not looking too hard at the things that the community does that would, looked at plainly, require you to leave. And since leaving would mean losing the community, you don't look too hard in the community, consciously or not. Helps you not look by providing the alternative explanations, the support consensus, and the cultural permission to remain uncertain. It's just lovely. Just a lovely little circle there. I want to use a word here that kind of gets overused to the point of becoming nearly meaningless. And I want to use it precisely because the precise version is the useful one. Gaslighting. So this term comes from the 1944 film Gaslight, in which a husband systematically manipulates his wife into doubting her own perceptions of reality, dimming the gas lights, and then denying that the lights have changed, hiding objects, telling her she moved them, undermining her trust in her own memory and senses until she doubts her capacity to perceive reality accurately. You've all heard about it. Y'all know about it. So in clinical psychology, gaslighting describes a form of psychological manipulation in which a person or an institution causes someone to question the validity of their own perceptions and memories and reasoning and all that jazz, right? It is at its core an attack on the target's epistemic confidence, okay? The goal isn't necessarily to convince the target of a specific false belief. The goal is to make the target uncertain enough about their own capacity to perceive accurately that they stop trusting their own judgment and start deferring to the gaslighters. Now, here's the thing I want to say, okay? Gaslighting is not always like this big dramatic show. It's not always malicious either. And it's not always conscious, you know. Gaslighting happens in these small, mundane, and seemingly harmless ways constantly at work, you know, in the workplace, in families and friendships, in our own internal monologue. And we all do it to some degree. I do it. You do it. Don't deny it. We all do it. And usually not from malice, you know. Usually it's from self-protection or conflict avoidance, maybe, you know, from the very human desire to not have to deal with the implications of someone else's accurate perception, right? You're being oversensitive. That's not what I said. You're remembering that wrong. You're reading too much into it. Everyone does that. It's not a big deal. You're the only one who has a problem with this. These are not always lies, right? Sometimes people genuinely remember things differently. Sometimes the perception is, in fact, distorted. You know, context matters, intent matters, the relationship matters. But as a pattern, as a repeated strategy in response to someone's accurate perception of something uncomfortable, these are the tools of gaslighting. And they work because they target the most vulnerable point in human existence. You know, the fact that we are not infallible perceivers, and we know it. And that knowledge can kind of be weaponized against us, right? The institutional version of gaslighting is the same thing. It's kind of scaled up and systemic. So when a company's HR department responds to a complaint about systemic discrimination by saying, you know, we take all concerns seriously, and then does jack shit, and then suggests that the person who complained might be difficult to work with or not a culture fit, and then denies that the complaint has anything to do with the subsequent lack of promotions, that's gaslighting as infrastructure. Okay? Each individual element is deniable. The pattern is the thing. Or when a pharmaceutical company funds studies designed to produce null results and then cites the null results as evidence that their product is safe while burying internally the studies that showed harm, that's gaslighting at a population level. Okay? The public's being given selectively curated information that is designed to undermine their ability to accurately assess risk. Their own natural tendency to trust expert consensus is being used against them. Maybe when a political party responds to documented evidence of wrongdoing by questioning the motives of everyone who documented it, calling the documentation partisan, and generating enough alternative narrative that the public feels too uncertain to draw a conclusion, that's gaslighting as a governing strategy. And it's happening. It's happening. The reason it works, the reason it keeps working, is the betrayal blindness mechanism, right? So if you depend on the institution, you are already motivated to doubt the threatening perception. The gaslighting just provides the vocabulary for the doubt you are already looking for permission to feel. So, mechanics of how this happens inside the individual mind, because it's important to understand this is not, you know, a flaw in your character. You're not broken in some way. It is literal cognitive architecture, okay? Motivated reasoning is the process by which emotional investment in a conclusion shapes the reasoning process used to evaluate evidence. So there's a psychologist, Ziva Kunda, who coined the term in a landmark 1990 paper in Psychological Bulletin. It was demonstrated that people evaluate evidence differently depending on whether they want the conclusion to be true, okay? When motivated to reach a particular conclusion, people kind of search for evidence more selectively, and they apply like a more lenient criteria to confirming evidence and more stringent criteria to disconfirming evidence. And they construct more elaborate alternative explanations for the disconfirming evidence. Okay? They don't experience this process as biased. They experience it as careful reasoning. They feel like they're being thorough. They feel like they're considering all their angles. They don't feel like they're jumping to conclusions, right? The motivated reasoning process produces the subjective feeling of having thought something through while actually generating these more sophisticated justifications for the preferred conclusion, okay? Dan Cahan's cultural cognition research at Yale, which we touched on or will be touching on in a future episode about reality tunnels, kind of extends this into politically charged domains and found something that should make everyone really, really friggin' uncomfortable. Smarter people are often better motivated reasoners. Okay, so higher cognitive ability means more facility with constructing arguments, which means greater ability to construct convincing sounding rationalizations for conclusions that were reached on emotional or identity protective grounds. So intelligence in this context is not a protection against motivated reasoning. It is in specific conditions, it's more of like an amplifier, okay? There's a philosopher, Jonathan Haidt, the moral foundations theory approaches this from a slightly different angle. So he argues that moral reasoning is largely post hoc. We arrive at moral conclusions through rapid intuitive processes. You know, the emotional identity inflicted, the social gut check that kind of precedes this conscious deliberation, and then we construct arguments that justify these conclusions. The reasoning isn't finding the truth, it's just like building the brief for the verdict we already reached, right? This isn't a counsel of despair. You know, Haidt and others are clear that conscious deliberation can update intuitions over time, and that the exposure to different perspectives can kind of shift the initial gut reactions, and reasoning can genuinely change minds under the right conditions, right? But it means that presenting someone with evidence and expecting logic to do the work is kind of a naive model of how minds change. You know, minds change when the social environment changes, when the identity costs of acknowledging the evidence kind of decrease, and when the trusted community shifts its consensus. The evidence is often a trailing indicator. Okay, it's not so much a leading one. I want to be specific about the industry that exists to exploit all of this as well, because it does exist and it's large and it's sophisticated. It's not a slam at all in the United States, but the public relations industry in the U.S. alone generates approximately $15 billion in annual revenue. That's a hell of a lot of money spent on managing what the public perceives and believes about organizations. I would compare that to the Canadian government and the CBC. But anyway, some of that work is genuinely benign, you know, communicating accurate information to interested parties, managing crises that aren't the organization's fault, and telling true stories about true things, for sure. But a significant portion of it is something else entirely. It's the manufacture of uncertainty in service of organizational self-interest. Nephew of Sigmund Freud, Edward Bernays, widely considered the father of modern public relations, was brutally honest about this in his 1928 book, Propaganda. He wrote that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is a pretty important element in a democratic society, and that those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power. He wasn't complaining. Bro was just explaining his job. Okay. He himself ran campaigns linking cigarettes to women's lib, successfully repositioning smoking as a feminist act in the service of tobacco company profits. He engineered a coup in Guatemala in 1954 on behalf of the United Fruit Company, convincing the U.S. government that a democratically elected leader was a communist threat. He made bacon and eggs the American breakfast at the behest of the pork company by getting doctors whose expertise in breakfast composition was specialized to endorse a hearty breakfast. You know, the tools haven't changed much. Third-party validation from apparent experts, strategic ambiguity in the face of clear evidence, reframing criticism as politically motivated, creating the appearance of a debate where none meaningfully exists among actual subject matter experts, funding think tanks and advocacy organizations that produce reports supporting predetermined conclusions cloaked in the visual language of independent scholarship, seeding social media with content designed to feel organic. I could go on and on and on, but I won't because I just went on too much already. Each of these tools works because it targets a specific cognitive vulnerability. Third-party expert validation works because we evolved to trust social consensus as a proxy for truth in ancestral environments. If most people in your group agreed that a berry was poisonous, trusting that consensus was adaptive, right? Strategic ambiguity works because human minds facing genuine uncertainty kind of default toward inaction. The appearance of scholarly debate works because most people cannot evaluate the technical merits of complex scientific claims and reasonably defer to apparent expert consensus. And like I said, that organic feeling social media content works because social proof, and that's the sense that people like you believe something, is one of the strongest influencers of belief formation. None of this would work if the people on the receiving end were purely logical. It works because it operates on the pre-logical, social, identity-inflected layer of belief formation that is, for most of us, most of the time, where the real decisions happen and the logic comes after. So I said at the beginning that I'm kind of more awake to the games now than I used to be. I want to be honest about what that does and does not mean. It doesn't mean I've escaped. I haven't. There are almost certainly institutions I'm still inside of and loyalties that I still maintain and explanations I'm still accepting because, I don't know, the flip side of it would cost too much, I can't see those clearly because the nature of the blindness is that you can't see it. That's the whole mechanism, right? What I can see is the places I've already been, the institutions I gave more than they gave back, the times maybe I applied creative interpretive charity to behaviors that would have registered as red flags in anyone else's situation because they were happening to me and the stakes were mine, right? The explanations I constructed, the people I recruited to confirm those explanations, the fact that surrounding myself with people who agreed with me was evidence of my social skill, not evidence that I was right. All of that stuff. I can see those things now because I'm on the other side of them, not because I'm smarter or more perceptive than, the person I was inside of them. I wasn't wrong because I was naive. I was wrong because the mechanisms are genuinely powerful, and they are specifically powerful against people who have the most to lose by seeing clearly. So what I found personally is that geographic and social distance helps, not in a more simplistic move away from your problem sense, but in the literal sense that the strength of betrayal blindness is proportional to the strength of dependence, and the strength of motivated reasoning is proportional to the social cost of the accurate conclusion. When the dependence decreases and the social cost decreases, and when you've built or found a community that doesn't require the particular loyalty in question, the perceptual access kind of improves, right? You can see things you genuinely couldn't see before, not because you were refusing to see them, but because the cognitive cost of seeing them was prohibitive, right? This is why cults exit, right? I use the word carefully and broadly to mean exit from any high control, high dependency organization is so difficult. Cult exit is so difficult and it's disorienting for the people trying to do it, right? The person leaving isn't just changing their beliefs. They're dismantling and reconstructing the whole entire social infrastructure within which their beliefs made sense. And they're doing it without the community that formerly provided the consensus reality that made the beliefs feel validated. Like, it is a genuine cognitive and social emergency. And the people who mock cult members for not leaving sooner have not thought carefully about what it actually costs. So going back real quick to parsimony, because I want to talk about it a sec. Like, I don't want to treat it as a closing argument, okay? The principle of parsimony, prefer the simplest explanation that fits the facts. It's useful for exactly the reason it's uncomfortable in institutional context. Like, it cuts through this elaborate alternative explanations that betrayal, blindness, and motivated reasoning kind of generate. The simple explanation for why the company keeps finding reasons not to promote women. The simple explanation for why the organization's financial disclosures keep containing surprises. The simple explanation for why the institution's official story keeps requiring updates after investigative journalism forces new information into the open. The simple explanation is often the correct one. Not always, though. Institutions are complicated and incentives are genuinely mixed, and the most dramatic interpretation of a pattern of behavior is not always the most accurate one. But the place where Occam's razor specifically earns its keep is in the territory of our motivated resistance to it, right? In noticing the moment when we reach for something a little more complex just because the simple explanation threatens the hell out of us for whatever reason. That noticing is kind of the most often honest thing that I can offer as a practice. Not always believe the simplest explanation, but notice when you're working unusually hard to complicate a simple one, and then ask yourself why. If the answer to why is because the simple explanation would cost me something I'm not ready to lose, that's information that you want to pay attention to, okay? You might still decide the cost isn't worth paying right now. That's a legitimate choice. That's fine. But you're making it consciously with knowledge of what you're doing rather than genuinely believing the complicated explanation is more accurate. That's different. It doesn't sound that different, but it is. So I didn't set out to run my mouth about all this, and make it a comforting episode. I don't think that it is. The picture it describes is genuinely difficult. I think that we are all, to some degree, subject to mechanisms that operate below conscious awareness to protect us from information that would require costly action. Institutions are aware of these mechanisms and routinely exploit them and us. And being intelligent and educated or psychologically sophisticated doesn't constitute protection from any of this at all. It just kind of changes the vocabulary you use when you're constructing the alternate explanation for it, right? But I also don't think it's a hopeless picture because the mechanisms are knowable. The architecture itself is visible once you know what you're looking at, and the practices that strengthen your capacity to see clearly, like building genuine independence from any single institution's approval or resources, maybe cultivating relationships outside your primary community, and kind of developing the habit of applying Occam's razor specifically to your own most defended conclusions, and being honest with yourself about the difference between genuine uncertainty and motivated uncertainty. These are real practices with real effects, okay? I know I'm still being fooled in places I can't see. I know that. What's changed, though, is that I know it, and I can admit it. My ego's not getting in the way here. I'm not operating under the assumption that my current explanations are all correct and my current loyalties are all deserved. I'm kind of holding them more loosely. I have more willingness to look, even when looking is uncomfortable. Especially, that's when it matters the most, okay? The simplest explanation for why you find this episode unsettling, if you do, is that some of what I've described is recognizable, not in abstract other people. It's in yourself. It's in a situation that matters to you. The recognition is the beginning of something, and I think it's up to you, what you want to do with it. I'm going to put, a lot of the points of things that I researched for this episode in the show notes. If you're curious, I'm not just making stuff up here. I researched this stuff, and I'm going to share some of those things in the show notes. If you want to contact me or anything, that's also in the show notes. Link to the Facebook group is in the show notes. And if you want to support the show production, that info is also in the show notes. I will see you on the next off-script episode.
And that brings us to the end of another episode of Unbound Off Script. Someone eventually had to pull the plug because, as you know, Beth will happily keep talking until the sun goes down. Thanks for listening, and we will see you whenever she finally runs out of things to say. I'm Rob, she's a blabbermouth, and we're out.
This episode is brought to you by ChatGPT. Hey, it's Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast. Have you guys heard about ChatGPT work? It's the new way to use ChatGPT for bigger multi-step projects. And when you need more than just answers, give ChatGPT work access to your apps and files, and it can create real work documents like spreadsheets, slides, and structured reports. Get started at chatgpt.com by selecting work mode, available on Plus and Pro plans.
I see you.
Avatar: Fire and Ash is now streaming on Disney Plus. It's the film critics are calling the best Avatar yet.
Go, 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 go!
A true epic and completely jaw-dropping.
This is the only pure thing in this world.
Return to Pandora on Disney Plus.
It will be an adventure for the whole family.
And watch the Oscar-winning phenomenon at home.
This is sick!
Avatar: Fire and Ash, now streaming on Disney Plus. Rated PG-13.